Not sure how much time y'all spend over on Reddit. Reddit is a fascinating place, especially if you're into real estate. The real estate community on Reddit is one of the largest communities on the platform, with well over 1 million members of the community. And it's a fascinating intersection of consumers. That's home buyers and sellers, investors, real estate attorneys, appraisers, inspectors, as well as, of course, agents and lenders, all sharing their experiences and commenting. And of course, it's the internet, so you get the extremes, you get the crazy people that are commenting on things. But every now and again, there is a post that, one, takes off in popularity, and two, I think offers some interesting insights, especially as relates to what I talk about here, DIY or self-represented home buying. So I found one of these posts. I wanted to break it down because I think it has a lot of relevance to DIY home buyers. And that's what we're going to get into in this episode. For those of you who are new, welcome to the DIY Homebuyer Podcast. I'm your host, Nick. Created this show and all of the resources that I'm creating to make a better home buying experience, one where I empower home buyers to represent themselves, represent their own best interests, and negotiate the best possible terms and price on a home that they want, navigate the buying process as smoothly as possible, and do all of that without having to pay a costly buyer's agent who, more often than not, I feel like kind of gets in the way of a smooth and successful sale. So with no further ado, let me dive into this post. The title of the post is Listing Agent and Unrepresented Buyers, How It's Going. And I'll link to this in the show notes in case you want to read it. But I'm going to read the post in its full. I'm also going to go through the issues. I believe that there's like 15 issues here that this listing agent highlights. And I kind of want to take each one in turn and address it for home buyers that are thinking about representing themselves. I'll be as fair as I possibly can, both to the listing agent as well as to self-representing buyers. So, of course, this is coming from the perspective of a licensed real estate agent, one who primarily does listings. Let's hear how their experience has been working with unrepresented buyers. So the post starts, "We are 5 months or so from the NAR lawsuit, and I wanted to share my experiences. I'm primarily a listing agent. Sellers are roughly 80% of my business. I work with investors and have a different pricing for them. For my normal sellers that need handholding, here's what's up. I do not offer dual agency, but my broker does. Rare. It happened once. My average market price is $200,000. I charge 3% to list a home and is increased to 4% if the buyer is unrepresented. Why? Because there is no such thing as a free lunch, and I'm representing one side while facilitating the entire transaction. So far, I've had 4 sales with the buyer wanting no representation because they are, quote, saving money, unquote. Here's how that looks. The buyer probably saw the house through a private showing or an open house. We exchange info and the buyer shows interest. Since I'm not providing guidance or representation to the buyer, I say if they want to put an offer in, they can have an attorney draft one. We are not an attorney state, in parentheses. Or they can send me what terms they want to offer and I will present to the seller. They send over a pre-approval and name a price, and this is where I get to work. I communicate all of the details to the seller since I am just representing them. We craft a counter offer on a sales contract that gets the seller everything they want. Any decent buyer agent would find half a dozen things to counter, as our contracts have over 30 areas to negotiate. But the buyer usually accepts it. Other than my initial email outline with all of the important dates, I am not allowed to give the buyer guidance. Inevitably, this is where things get hairy because they don't know the process, especially if they think agents just open doors. Let me outline just a few of the issues I've had with the 4 unrepresented buyers. And I'll pause here before we get into this list of 15 issues that this agent has. A few things that I want to highlight. Um, One is that we're talking about a sample size of four unrepresented buyers that this person has worked with, which is not a huge sample size. So we just need to have that at the very outset. Like he or she, it's kind of unclear, but this listing agent is making some assertions just based on a very anecdotal sort of experience. And then also, we have to think about the average market price being only $200,000. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. I know that $200,000 is a lot of money to a lot of folks, but the percentages, right? Like 3% on $200,000 is way different than 3% on 700,000 or a million or 1.2 million, right? And that's what's so funny about real estate agency and commissions and how those get paid, whether you're a buyer agent or a seller agent, is that it's percentage based, even though the fundamental amount of work hardly changes. It hardly scales between a $200,000 property and a $1.2 million property. Like it's not 10 times the amount of work to sell something that's $1.2 million versus a $200,000 home. And yet somebody that's selling that $1.2 million home is making 10 times as much, essentially. So that's a little bit of an aside, but it is interesting to note here to just say, okay, so this listing agent says I charge 3% to list a home, but if there's an unrepresented buyer, then I charge the seller 4% to work with that unrepresented buyer because it creates additional work for the listing agent, is what they contend. So just keep that in mind, that the listing agent is saying, one, I've only done this with 4 people. Two is that I charge the seller more to work with an unrepresented buyer. And the reason that this agent is charging the seller more is because of all of the additional work and headaches, allegedly, that the unrepresented or self-represented buyer creates. One more thing I want to point out before we get into this list of issues is that in this sort of final line here, the person who posted this, the listing agent, writes, other than my initial email outline with all the important dates, I'm not allowed to give the buyer guidance. And this is an interesting line because on one hand, it's true. Guidance is a bit of a vague word. The listing agent's responsibility is to represent the financial interests of the seller, but part of representing their financial interests is treating the self-representing buyer as a valued customer and bringing the sale to a close, right? Like they are allowed to provide a high degree of customer service to ensure a smooth and successful transaction. Now, they can't do that to the financial detriment of their client or do anything that isn't objectively in their client's best interest. But if it means like reminding a home buyer of different like deadlines or dates or things that are coming up so that the buyer doesn't default and the transaction doesn't fall apart, it's totally okay for the listing agent to make those reminders, especially if it's at the bidding of the seller. I suppose if the seller said, hey, I don't actually want this transaction to close. Like my goal is for the self-represented buyer to default so that I can keep their earnest money and then go back onto the market. Then the listing agent would have the prerogative to like make it as difficult as possible for the home buyer to move forward. But that seems very unlikely. Like that seems like you're winning the battle but losing the war as a seller. I think most all reasonable sellers would prefer to have the transaction close and would prefer for their agent to do everything within their power to help the buyer along in the process so that the transaction has the highest likelihood of actually closing. So I would want more clarification from this listing agent on what do they mean by not being allowed to give the buyer guidance. I get that they can't help the buyer with understanding how to negotiate or what contingencies to include. But once those things are set and the contract is signed, I don't see any issue with the listing agent helping a self-represented buyer just adhere to deadlines. Let's get into these issues though. So, number one, they say that this unrepresented buyer did not send the earnest money. So for anybody who is unfamiliar, most of you will know that when you go under contract for a home, part of that contract is you have a set number of days, usually about 3 days, to submit your earnest money. And that earnest money typically ranges from 1 to 3% of the purchase price of the home. Let's say because these are a little bit lower priced homes, $200,000, let's just say that earnest money is 3%, so $6,000. If the home buyer doesn't submit the earnest money on time, they're in breach of the contract. And because there's no earnest money, there's nothing on the line. Essentially, at that point, the seller just rips up the contract. And what's interesting here is that's an issue. But frankly, this happens all the time with home buyers, whether they are self-represented or whether they have their own agent. Like I am an agent. I've worked with lots and lots and lots of buyers, and I've been on the listing side on many, many occasions. And so I've seen it from both perspectives where having an agent makes no difference as to whether or not a buyer is actually going to perform on depositing their earnest money. And if they get cold feet, the easiest way for them to get out of the contract is to not submit the earnest money. So while this is an issue, I wouldn't say that this is something unique to self-representing buyers. And perhaps it's a fault of them not knowing, but more than likely, they just got cold feet, and this would happen either way. Number two is this listing agent says an issue is the self-represented buyer had only had a home inspection done. They did not have the septic, sewer lateral, termite, gas, radon testing done, and they didn't ask for repairs in writing by the deadline. So honestly, this is a big one. And this is why, if you are going to represent yourself as a home buyer, getting educated on the home buying process is so important. And why I create the content I create is because of the lack of resources, quality resources available to buyers that want to represent themselves, to understand the importance of inspections and the different kinds of inspections that are available to you as a home buyer, and the importance of requesting your repairs or operating within the defined timelines of your inspection contingency. So again, this is something that is negotiated at the time of contract, how long that inspection contingency is. Generally, 10 to 14 days is the kind of average for an inspection contingency. And what that means is that you need to have all of your inspections done, and then you need to submit in writing to the seller what it is that you're wanting for them to do, whether that's you want to terminate the contract on the grounds of an unsatisfactory inspection, or whether you want to renegotiate the purchase price or seller paid credits, or whether you want the seller to do repairs. All of those things need to be done before the expiration date of that inspection contingency, because once you get past that expiration date, that contingency is gone. It's essentially, it's automatically waived. And so now you can't back out of the agreement on the grounds of an inspection contingency. If you're to back out, you are at risk of losing your earnest money because you didn't adhere to the timelines defined in the contract. So this is a really big deal. Now, this is again where I'd put it back on the listing agent and say, hey, couldn't you have reminded them or asked if the seller was going to be seeing a inspection request for repairs. One, that's in service to the seller. Like the seller doesn't want to have the property tied up and off market on somebody who may be backing out anyway. So it serves the seller to have a listing agent who's on top of it and trying to get that contingency waived, cleared, resolved as quickly as possible. Because the worst is when you've taken your house off the market for 14 days and on the 14th day, the buyer says, yeah, we're going to terminate on the grounds of the inspections. Because then you've just wasted 2 weeks of time to market the property. So you really, as a listing agent, I would think that this guy could have been more helpful to the self-representing buyer, but the ultimate responsibility here is on the DIY home buyer to make sure that they're adhering to their inspection timelines. All right, number 3, the lender told them they could change the loan type and save money, except they couldn't because it had to be conventional financing, not FHA. Those buyers lost a decent amount of earnest money because they did not abide within the financing deadline. Now, this is a good point as well, and something that I go over in my free course for DIY home buyers, which you can find a link to in the description below. But while it is possible, so let me back up. When you go under contract on a home, if you're financing the home, there will be a financing addendum. And in that addendum, you specify upfront to the seller both the type of loan that you're securing as well as the amount of money that you are putting down. This gives the seller confidence or an idea of, okay, what is one, the appraisal process going to look like? And two, how much room is there should the house not appraise, or just basically how financially qualified. The more that you're putting down, the less risk there is of there being financing issues in the 11th hour. So it is true that as well, like once you got set up with a conventional loan, but because of changes in interest rates or just as the lender looks closer at your financial situation, they may say, hey, actually an FHA loan would be a better product for you. You may want to switch, but if you have it in the contract that you are moving forward with a conventional loan, you actually have to get the seller's approval. You need to make an amendment to or an addendum to the contract that says buyer and seller agree for buyer to change from conventional financing to FHA financing. I mean, this is, again, don't take this as, don't sue me. Don't take this as legal advice, like in terms of exactly how you should word that, right? Because we're talking about like legal language and addendums. And so this is an area where you may want to talk with a real estate attorney, but essentially it's something to that effect of where you're wanting to say, hey, you need to get the seller's approval to change the loan type. And 9 times out of 10, because again, the seller's motivated to get the deal closed, they're going to be fine with it. FHA lending does have more stringent requirements, and the appraisal process is a bit more intense. It could also slow things down. So there are legitimate reasons why a buyer or why a seller could say no. But it is possible. You just need to have the seller's permission. So I'd say that's a fair point, because if the seller doesn't approve the change in financing, they do have the right to terminate the agreement and to keep your earnest money as a home buyer, which you don't want. Number 4, I don't know how this is. Anyhow, here's what it says. One of them did not have an email, which meant they needed to drive to my office to pick up documents, and my office was an hour away. I don't really know how that's an issue. I suppose that's inconvenient. I mean, clearly this person, again, whether they're unrepresented or not, like they have strong feelings about internet and email because email is free. And so if they wanted one, they could easily have set one up. So I'm going to take it that they were fine to drive whatever distances they needed to in order to pick up documents, make the transaction work. Maybe that was a little bit more annoying for the listing agent, but so what? That's just part of the job. There's always going to be annoyances and difficulties in every transaction and every job, whatever you're doing. So that's a funny complaint that he put on there. I'm not going to spend much time on it. Number 5, the seller provided occupancy inspection as outlined in the contract, but the buyer didn't notice, it was not a passing occupancy. I'd need more detail. I mean, this sounds like new construction, or maybe there were permits and a rehab kind of project. Um, I don't really know how this gets past anyone, and it sounds pretty shady. Um, like if there's a lender involved, the lender would need to see the certificate of occupancy, and they would need to know that it was passing. So that this makes me think it was a cash deal. And in that case, like I would really think that part of the seller and the listing agent's responsibilities to be truthful in their representation of a property would be to clarify that a property doesn't pass occupancy inspection. Um, so, I mean, that's, the buyer should have looked closer, but I would bet that if the buyer wanted to pursue legal action here, they would probably have grounds to do so, because that to me seems like something that should be disclosed, like that's material fact, an issue with the home, that it doesn't pass the occupancy inspection. And if the buyer is surprised by that, it makes me think that either one, they were just really negligent in their due diligence, which is possible. Some home buyers can be very negligent, and that's again why I'm doing the buyer education. And if you're listening to this podcast, I really don't fear that that's you, but either the buyer was negligent, or the seller and the listing agent hid something that was material fact. I think that the latter situation is more likely, and I feel bad for that buyer. And hopefully there's some legal ground that they have to try and remedy that and make it right. Number 6, the unrepresented buyer didn't show up for the walkthrough. And again, that's situational. People don't show up to things all the time. It's smart as a home buyer to show up for a final walkthrough just before closing, making sure that the property is in the condition that you remember it being in when you went to contract on it, that there wasn't any new damage, that there weren't things removed from the home or added to it that you weren't expecting at the time that you went to contract or as mentioned in the contract. So always recommended for home buyers to go to those final walkthroughs. Now, did the listing agent do what they could ever needed to just remind the buyer of what the timeline was? I don't know what that communication looked like. Sounds to me like they weren't really going to lift a finger to help the buyer or help the transaction along. I also don't know that not showing up for a walkthrough would totally derail a transaction either. And there are still remedies that, like, if there were things again like that were promised in the contract and that the seller didn't perform on, while it's helpful to address those things in the walkthrough prior to closing, there's still recourse available to you as a home buyer if the seller didn't perform on the terms of the agreement. Number 7, never got the utilities on in their name, and utilities were turned off the next day. Which again, I'm raising my eyebrows to this one. There's usually a bit of a grace period there. I guess it's possible that the utility company could have come out and turned off the utilities, but frankly, that's a pretty easy fix. We talk about it in the DIY Homebuyer Academy, the need for how to just get utilities switched over, the timeline for all of that. But that's not like a end of the world sort of situation. It's usually just a little misunderstanding. And once they turn your water off, you're pretty motivated to figure that out and get it turned back on very quickly. And most municipalities are helpful on that front. Number 8, call/email me at least a dozen times wanting advice and counsel. How do I get out of the contract? How do I read the title commitment? What does X mean? And I can't provide it. And yes, so as a DIY home buyer, there are limits to what you can expect of the listing agent. You got to remember that they are treating you as a customer, but they do not represent you. They don't really work for you. They work for the seller. And so they're there to help close the transaction. They do owe the responsibility of being truthful, disclosing material fact, answering questions about the home that they know. But when it comes to contractual sort of advice, they're limited on what they can give. They can explain what different things mean, but they can't tell you, like, it would not be beneficial to their seller for them to tell you as a DIY home buyer how to get out of the contract. So that's fair. DIY home buyers shouldn't be asking that of a listing agent. How do you read a title commitment? Fortunately, the title company that provides the title commitment, they have customer service representatives that are there to help you as a home buyer understand the title commitment, to go through it together. So no real issues there. And in terms of what does X mean, usually a listing agent could answer what that means, anything that's related to the transaction. That's fine. Although there's also so many other ways that home buyers can get that information from a more trusted source, from somebody that doesn't have the seller's best interests at heart. And that's part of why I've created the DIY homebuyer community, is so that you can ask questions to myself and other DIY home buyers that are going through the process to be like, hey, what does this mean? And you can get more neutral, unbiased advice. Let's see. Number 9, find out they had a house to close on before they could buy. So this is poorly worded, but it sounds to me like what this guy is saying is that they found out that they needed to sell their house and get the funds from that house before they could close on the next house that they were buying. And this just kind of gets into the larger category of having good financial preparation up front. And that's why my whole first module in the DIY homebuyer course is about financial preparation, so that you understand what it means to be contingent upon the sale of your existing house, so that you have the funds to close on your new home, and what the timing of that has to look like in order for those funds to be available. So that could well be a miss on the homebuyer's part. It also seems crazy to me, like this listing agent, I would think that if they didn't ask that question or press in a bit more or talk with the lender, there's some negligence on the listing agent's part as well, to get to the 11th hour. It sounds at least like get to the 11th hour and then find out, oh, we have a house we need to close on first. That's a pretty obvious and big one. You shouldn't get very far in a transaction before that becomes very apparent. Number 10 is that the self-represented buyer didn't fill out the title paperwork, which delayed closing. So, yeah, there are title will be sending you documents, and as a home buyer, you've got to be responsible to fill those things out in a timely manner. And if you don't, then there can be delays to closing. And if those delays are too long, that can cost you. It can cost you the whole transaction. It can cost you your earnest money. There could even be legal actions that the seller could take against you. So take the process of buying a home seriously, and I'm here to help keep you organized. It does help to have like a community, to have people that are in your corner that are helping keep you on track throughout the entire process. I just don't think that you need to pay an agent 3% of the purchase price of the house in order to keep you on track for these things. Like, do you really need to pay somebody else $15,000 to have them hound you about filling out paperwork? Let's all just be adults and do that ourselves. Number 11 is same, ditto with the required lender documents. So same exact answer. If the lender sends you things, you got to respond to those in a timely manner, or else it creates all kinds of hiccups in underwriting, which can lead to delays in closing. Number 12, this guy complains about the self-representing buyer choosing a terrible lender who I know will not close on time. We have extra money in the contract as a non-refundable when this happens. And again, this is fair. Like, not all lenders are created equal. And so even though somebody will give you the best rate within the real estate industry and among the agent communities, the big lending shops like Rocket Mortgage and what are some of the big online ones, like kind of Loan Depot style lenders. Most agents have had bad experiences with those companies where they just don't come through. They create delays, or at the end, things fall apart. And I think that that's fair for a listing agent to say, yeah, I don't like this lender. I've had bad experiences. So to protect my seller, I'm going to increase the amount of earnest money that you need to pay if you're going to work with that lender. So as a home buyer, the solution is work with a local trusted lender, somebody that you've got a relationship with. The fees might be a little bit higher. Make sure you're not paying through the nose on interest rate compared to what you'd get with Rocket Mortgage. Usually those things are a little bit easier to negotiate and get a local lender to match. But there is a real benefit to working with somebody local who picks up their phone on a Saturday morning or late on a Friday night or Thursday night right before closing in order to make sure that the closing happens. Number 13, the this is just a little dig, but he complains the unrepresented buyers say something along the lines of how much money they are saving and how agents are overpaid every single time. And I've talked about this in other episodes and videos and content that I've done. This is fair that, hey, I realize that many of us who are going down the DIY homebuyer path are doing so because of bad experiences we've had with agents and feeling like they are not worth the money that they're getting paid relative to the value that they provide to a transaction. I've been vocal about that. But there's a time and a place to make those comments. And if you are a DIY homebuyer, the place to make those comments is not directly to the listing agent that you're working with. As I've talked with the other people that have done DIY home buying, like the constant theme there is by bringing a sort of positive energy to the transaction, to the relationships, to the communications with the listing agent, with the seller. All of that goes a long, long way in a smooth transaction, an enjoyable transaction, and one where, frankly, as a home buyer, the seller and listing agent are most happy to work with you, which generally leads to you getting a better deal or better terms. So yeah, don't try and poke the bear or just say inflammatory things to make an agent mad. That doesn't get anybody anywhere. So again, I don't think that anybody listening to this podcast needs to be reminded of that. But if you do hear of DIY home buyers who are disparaging agents to the agents that they are working with, like the listing agent on the other side of the transaction, yeah, let them know that it's unsurprising that things don't go well for them when that happens. Number 14, I am now obliged to physically meet the appraiser, inspector, insurance company, contractor, occupancy inspector, buyer walkthrough because I'm facilitating the transaction. So this listing agent is saying, this unrepresented buyer is making so much more work for me because I have to be at the house a whole lot more than if there was another agent involved in the deal. And this is where I think that agents have gotten lazy, for one, like listing agents say, hey, like your job is to sell the house. So like you're signing up to do whatever it takes to sell the house for your client. And if that means showing up at the house more to just be there for a passive meeting with unlocking the house for an appraiser or an inspector, like, so what? Like, build that into your business. Don't penalize your seller for doing your job. This is just a silly sort of a complaint. And then the final one, 15. The absolute worst is that unrepresented buyers don't take deadlines seriously, or they act like it's my fault for them missing it. And while I've said that I believe this listing agent probably could be more helpful than they allow themselves to be with reminding the buyer of deadlines, the responsibility of maintaining those deadlines is on the home buyer. So it is important that you know what those deadlines are and that you adhere to them and that you have the sort of organizational systems built up so that you do not miss out on those, lose a bunch of earnest money, create a bunch of headaches for people. Really what it is it's just communication is so key in everything in life, but especially in real estate transactions. And so if it does seem like you're going to miss a deadline, whether that's earnest money or you need more time to get a bid back from a contractor before clearing the inspection contingency, like a lot of these problems can be headed off just by communicating them up front. And if the seller is stuck between extending your inspection contingency by a couple of days or you terminating the agreement and getting your earnest money back because you weren't able to do sufficient inspections in the timeline provided, again, most sellers are going to say, okay, I'll extend it by a couple of days to give you the time that you need. But you have to do that up front. That's something that you have to be proactive on, not reactive on, or else the deal will often fall apart. So the agent says, so all of this stress for an extra $2,000, that's more like $1,000 after broker fees and expenses, is not worth it. I'd much rather a competent agent be on the other side and make it a fair fight. I feel like the seller can definitely get more money when the buyer is self-represented, but they also have more to lose out on if the buyer totally flakes. The other part of this is that at the price point I work in is a lot of first-time buyers. So it's not their fault. They don't have the knowledge, or what knowledge they have is bad. I try to approach each one as an individualized, but man, I'm noticing the same repeating patterns and I don't like it. My rate will be increasing before this crazy spring market hits. And there's a few things to unpack. Like I get that there's a nominal amount of extra work that is created for the listing agent here, and I suppose that's something that he can talk to the seller about, of just saying that like, hey, if it's an unrepresented buyer, like I need an extra $1,000 for the extra time that I'm spending. But and again, it's somewhat relative based upon the sale price of the home. I just think got to get away from a percentage-based model on that, because 1% of $1 million is an extra $10,000, and it's not an extra $10,000 of work to work with a self-represented buyer. It's just not. It's not worth an extra $10,000 for a seller to pay their agent just to show up for appraisals and inspections and those kinds of things. That's so silly. Again, listing agents a lot of them have just gotten really lazy. It's fascinating to me that this guy says that, hey, I'd much rather a competent agent be on the other side and make it a fair fight, which does not sound like something an agent who has their client's best interests in mind would say, right? Like that. And it gets at a lot of the irony of sellers. Why would you offer an upfront compensation to an agent that is supposed to be fighting you? Like, why are you paying somebody who's working against you? That's silly, and it just makes transacting real estate more expensive. So the listing agent kind of shows their cards in that line. They do say that they believe the seller can get more money when the buyer is unrepresented. I only believe that's the case if the self-representing buyer wants it to be that way, because they want their offer to be more competitive. But I talk in other videos and content a lot about how DIY homebuyers can leverage their status of not having an agent to get better value, better deal on their home. And he mentions that there's just a lack of buyer knowledge, buyer education. And that, again, just puts the exclamation point on why creating this kind of content is so important and why we need more educated homebuyers and consumers. Because if people understood how the home buying process worked, I just believe that most everybody has the competence to represent themselves. Transacting real estate is really not all that hard. And so you have the competence, but what you need is the confidence to navigate the transaction. And that confidence comes through education. So that's what I'm about educating home buyers how to navigate the process. And I've mentioned it a few times now. This is not a pitch, but it's just to say that, hey, I do have the free DIY homebuyer community that's hosted through the school platform. I'd just love for you to join there. Go through the DIY homebuyer fundamentals course to get a really good feel for how the process works. Ask your questions, anything that you're wondering about, share your experiences there, engage in that community. Because again, it's worth at least asking the question. If you're thinking about buying a home, at least ask yourself the question, could I do this myself? And what would the advantages of doing so be? All right, that's what I've got for this episode. Hopefully, that's helpful. I think it's fascinating to share from an agent's perspective what they feel about working with self-representing buyers. That should be helpful to you to try and put yourself in their mindset. I don't think that this is a great. I don't think this is a great agent. Most agents that you deal with, listing agents, are probably going to be better, probably be more receptive and helpful than this person is. But this is representative of at least one person, and so there's probably more out there that have similar kind of takes. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe to the channel, and even better than that would be if you would share this with somebody that you know who's thinking of buying a home. Just get their wheels turning on different options, different approaches. Have them consider, is DIY home buying right for me? And if you're listening to this on another platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, gosh, a 5-star review and hitting the follow, subscribe button, it works wonders in terms of increasing the reach of this show. And again, the mission here is to make a better home buying experience for everybody. And I can't do that without you, literally. Have to have you as part of that, helping to join that mission and spread it further and wider. So I'm grateful that you're here. I'm grateful that you've come across this. Do let me know what resonates. Feel free to get in touch. You can find all of those links in the show notes in the description below, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, happy home buying.